Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 3 of the Metacratic podcast. On today's episode, we're going to be discussing prescription drugs, particularly how they work and how they're prescribed in Canada to different groups of individuals. So as we know, Canadians have a universal healthcare system, which is called Medicare, but there are some differences between the universal aspects of regular healthcare policies and prescription drugs. So basically, the gist of how it works is if you are prescribed a prescription drug in a Canadian hospital, then under the Canadian Health Act, it's under no cost. But if you're not in a hospital, it's different, and it's usually from individual or public insurance plans. And so I guess we can start talking about how effective that is. And is there any way that we can try to make prescription of drugs more similar to our Medicare, our universal healthcare policies?
Okay, so I'll start. I was in a clinic, and this is where the topic just came to me. And what I noticed is that, especially the case I saw was for a specific type of blood thinner. So the patient had a specific condition that you couldn't give them the standardized medication or like first-line treatment for a blood thinner. So they have to put him on a special one. And that special one was not covered. And they told him the price of that blood thinner, and he was not able to afford it, unfortunately. So they had to look for another alternative, combine it with another sort of medication to adjust for his condition. And as probably all you know, when you combine multiple medication, if someone has a specific condition, it's gonna cause more adverse effects. So that's why I was thinking it quite be unfair to a certain level. Why just because you're a special condition and because of your socioeconomic status, you're limited to certain drugs that might not be most effective relative to what is available in the market.
So was this a commonly prescribed blood thinner, or was it something special that the patient required?
Most first-line treatments are covered. This specific one was not a first-line treatment. He couldn't receive the first line for some reasons. I did not notice why. But the physician told me that, we cannot put him on that specific one. We have to look for an alternative. But the alternative was costly. And this is where the problem comes from. Because people not responding to first-line treatment is not as uncommon. So many people has to probably search for an alternative method. And usually those are not covered.
Okay. I mean, that brings up the interesting point of as we're going to talk about how your economic status or socioeconomic status can impact the kinds of drugs you can access, right? And when we are looking at this from an ethical standpoint, especially in Canada, where we want to provide the same quality of healthcare to everybody, regardless of their status, we kind of see a discrepancy there, right? Even though everyone should get the same healthcare because they can't access certain drugs that are not covered by social insurance, we still have some kind of health inequalities there. So if we were to expand more on that, I guess, what do you guys think we could do to reduce the impact that your socioeconomic status has on your access to drugs? Like, is there a way to maybe reduce the cost of certain drugs and then make them more available? Or should we expand the coverage we give in terms of the secondary treatments that we could offer people as well? That are pretty common for certain conditions. As you said, it's not uncommon for people to not be able to take a certain primary treatment because of adverse effects, and then they have to resort to another treatment which may not be covered under insurance. So could we maybe just think about that, and then also make secondary treatments available for certain individuals? How do you think we should approach this?
I mean, what you're saying, which was something a little bit of stuff I read about, is similar to what some countries in Europe and the UK are doing, right now. And so a lot of government officials have been advocating for that by trying to incorporate prescription medicine, which they're calling it Pharmacare, so like Medicare, but for pharmaceuticals. And they're trying to implement that directly into the Canada Health Act, which it's not there right now. Only prescription medication under hospital admission is under the Canadian Health Act, so it's not under here. And while that can work, it takes a long time to change. So it may actually result in higher costs of individual medications. So I believe that the UK started changing it like 30 years ago or so. I don't know how they exactly handled it, but if they were to do that, it would cause some problems, but I'm not sure how it would work. So maybe making a universal Medicare for pharmacy would be kind of unfeasible, but I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can see how that could be an issue. When we're trying to fix one problem, we basically create more severe ones for the system that we already have in place, right?
I think that actually can be like for the long term. I do not have a solution for the short term, but over the long term, I think other alternatives for that specific medication are going to be available, and they probably going to compete with other pharmaceuticals. So they would probably produce it at a lesser cost, but still it's going to probably take a decent amount of time for them to be available. And at the same time, the difference in the price might be probably like maximum 30% cheaper. And since this type of medication, especially for a blood thinner, I think when I thinking about it, I think it was a replacement therapy, like for the cofactors. And it is quite costly. It is very costly. And if you want to make a program or make a Pharmacare to cover those type of costs, I do not know where we can fuel that Pharmacare, because those costs are going to be insanely high. And I think the health budget in Canada, it is limited to a certain point. I'm not sure if they can afford to expand it to such degree.
Yeah, it would cost probably a few $1 billion. So, I mean, this is more for the finances, but it would cost a few billion a year. But then long term, you would save a few billion a year, right? So trying to get that balance would be a real tough problem to get. So
I asked a physician about this actually, and his answers were interesting. He said it is ethical actually. And his reason for that is the first line treatment is essentially free for you. So if you look for an alternative, which is probably more expensive, then it would be fine if you charge, that would be charged. So what do you guys think about that?
Now, that's a little interesting when you talk about ethically, because I'm wondering if it's specific to, not the first line, but maybe another one that's common, but not the most common treatment. Is this kind of like a tax on the elderly population? Because they take many more prescriptions than any other group, right? So if they had these problems for not only one, but even multiple prescriptions, that's a heavy burden on these people who already don't have that much money themselves, right? Is that ethical in that sense, where it's kind of unjust for that group, but not the other?
I think the older people with public and private insurance plans, they get almost every single drug covered. Not every drug, but a lot more than normal. So there may be some problems in there, especially if they're not covered for a drug that they need. And then it's really hard to get covered for that because, they're limited by their time and money, obviously. But I think a lot of the problems are occurring in people who don't need social assistance and people that are below the age of like 65 or whatever is considered elderly. So I think that's like the biggest problem, because let's say you're like 35 or something and you get diagnosed with type 1 diabetes and you can't have standard insulin treatment and your insurance doesn't cover this like new treatment of insulin or whatever. And then you have to pay out of pocket. And we know that insulin is expensive, right? So I think that's like the main problems that people are having, especially in Canada, because, in the US, it's a lot more like insurance based. But here it's universal healthcare based. But pharmacy, just like dentistry and whatever, is insurance based. So it's a weird mix. Like if you get stuck in a part of the healthcare circle that isn't covered by the government or insurance, it's really hard to get out of that.
That is
Kind of.
Okay.
Go ahead, Berk.
Sure. So we kind of touched on like the age groups, right, that are the most affected by like basically the gaps in coverage. We talked about the older population, and I guess another population that we should talk about who is covered is people under 25, because obviously people between 25 and 65 are not covered at all for drugs. So for younger people who literally usually don't have any financial means for covering their own treatments, they're almost always dependent on, well, someone who takes care of them or a guardian. So we kind of are also putting pressure onto these people who are dependent on others, because they might not want to go to alternative treatment routes because they're going to feel like they're more of a burden to their caretakers than they already are, because they are requiring some treatments, and that takes some kind of toll on the people who are trying to take care of them. So when we also consider the ethical aspects of making secondary treatments more available, I feel like we also kind of should talk about people who are dependent on others, that being younger people, sometimes also older people. So what do you think like the intricacies are there with dependence, and how we can make it easier for people to kind of have access to any kind of treatment without having to worry, having to worry about like burdening other people who are trying to take care of them?
I think that issue becomes even more serious when someone who is under 25 develops a serious type of disease, such as a cancer. Because most effective method of treating cancer, like immunotherapies, most of them are covered in Canada, but not all of them. But the treatments are very, very specific to a cancer type. So if you cannot accept a specific type, or if you cannot afford it, your options would probably be limited to a chemotherapy or like a radiotherapy, which its effect on someone under 25 is gonna be insanely brutal. For those parts, that makes me even more concerned.
Yeah, I mean, individualized medicine as a whole is much more difficult to target. You have the problem that we have now, because I mean, there's like probably like a few hundred drugs out there that can probably fix like 99% of conditions, but like how well, right? Like you said, you can have immunotherapies for cancer that can be individualized and can cause much less symptoms and side effects and may actually help prolong life further, but they're unattainable. And so people would mainly get radiation and chemotherapy, which is much worse, right? So that brings it into kind of a more ethical standpoint, is how can we make it so that the most or all people in Canada can get the best possible treatment, instead of settling for like the list of 200 or whatever drugs that people have been using for the past 50 years or whatever.
Right, and who decides on which drugs are like supposed to be more accessible, right? Because all of this kind of comes down to funding, right? We're funding certain companies to produce more of a certain drug because someone believes that one is the best one to produce. And so there's also like a central kind of issue there. Like, is it even I know what the equivalent of the FDA is in Canada, but who is administering, like, what I'm saying, like the policies that choose certain drugs over others? Like, I feel like there's a lot of intricacies there on the government level as well.
There are multiple systems that can be like put in place. I forget, there's like a few names for them, but like the one that Canada uses is the people that make the most money and the people that benefit off the most are the pharmaceutical, like the drug companies and the insurance companies as well. I mean, it's how it works, right? So they're going to be making the most money because they're going to be selling their drug, right? That's extremely popular. So, I mean, that's an inherent problem in itself. You're mixing, that's a big problem in general in healthcare, mixing well-being and providing actual healthcare with, finances and monetary gain. So that's also a tough line to draw, because you need funding to help people, but then that can become corrupt very easily, and then you can mess up the whole system.
Yeah, because we basically turn people's health into a commercial instrument, right? We're trying to make money off of people's health and well-being. And that is something that a country like Canada should definitely not be prioritizing over so many other issues, like as we were talking about, people not being able to access primary treatments because of side effects. Like, what are they going to do? They're stranded, right? Maybe we should fund pharmaceutical companies to not prioritize a single drug that's most profitable. Now, I don't know if the Canadian government already does this, but they should probably produce a wide variety of drugs that could have a similar impact on people with maybe better coverage for secondary treatments and alternatives through that system.
It's going to be a little bit hard to remove that specific part of like not making profit out of it, because I know that a decent portion of the drugs that are being made in companies like Apotex, they are getting exported to other countries. I think around like 100 something countries. I think that's where the major profit comes from. So probably they would not prioritize to make as much for the actual country, like to be used in Canada. But at the same time, I cannot really see any short-term or any feasible way, especially at this economic climate, for a government or any sort of organization to fund such treatments. Mostly because those treatments are quite continuous. They're not actual treatments, they're just, palliative. So we just continue giving it until it is no longer required. The patient's it's gone. So there's no cap to the end of that patient's cost. And I don't think, especially right now, any organization wants to accept such burden.
Are there any other kind of facets we haven't talked about? I guess we didn't talk about one of the most controversial parts of it, where people between 25 and 65 are not covered at all, or are not eligible, with the pretense that is a population that is usually least dependent on drugs. And although statistically that might be true, I feel like it is actually not true that none of those people require the system, right? Because I'm sure in such a big population, such a big demographic, which probably constitutes most of the population, right? 25 to 65, I'm assuming is going to be the majority of the population, and we're not offering them any kind of prescription coverage. I feel like that is a pretty big gap, right? We're definitely leaving out a lot of people, and I don't know what you guys think of that. Should we discuss how we can include a broader age range, or do you think that's going to be too economically crippling for a system that's already kind of standing on one leg?
Maybe in a better economy, when things start to improve. It's going to cost money, right? There's no magical utopian solution in order to do this for $0. It's going to cost a few billion, and it's going to take time to implement it fully. But it's probably something, I think that, following the lead of what other countries are doing. So what the UK is doing, they took time in order to change that in the 90s or in the 80s or whatever. And it cost a lot of money and it took a lot of time. But now their healthcare system is for the better, because now they're running a universal healthcare system. I think so. Very similar. I know that for pharmaceuticals, that they actually fixed that problem that Canada is having now. And the age range for under 65, being elderly, obviously those people take a lot of medication, but there's also people above the age of 50 which also need a lot of medication, right? It's not like there's a line that separates. It's like a spectrum, and there's a lot of people that are sick right at that age. So you need to kind of target those people as well.
Because we could say it's not feasible, which is kind of true. It's not feasible to just change it, but that's not really an answer, right? If we could do something, how would we change it, even if it's just for a small population? I think the only thing that I could think of is if it was made in a similar fashion to a kind of tax bracket, where maybe it was based on income, where above a certain income line, which would shift with the basic level of necessity of money that you need to live, above a certain level of that, it would be a certain pay scale, and then below it would be partially funded by the government. And so you could potentially help some people who have lower SES, at least in terms of income, but again, that wouldn't get rid of the whole burden.
Yeah, I think that could work, separating it by that. But then also, I know that another solution that people came up with, which was adding it to to the actual Health Act would be like, you have a list of certain commonly prescribed drugs, which, you know, first line treatments, which are common. That stuff is under, you know, prescription, so universal healthcare. And then you separate it, so that's federal, that would be federal.
Mhm.
Then in each province, you would have certain rulings for new drugs that become available. So I don't know, like in the process of actually developing the drug in clinical trials, you might actually be able to see like, oh, if there's a large need for this drug, if it's actually going to be common in the market, and if there are a certain number of individuals who actually require, even if it's a small number, then we added it to that list, but on a provincial level, right? So
okay,
you keep updating that list, and it's going to increase the annual cost of the Pharmacare or whatever. But I mean, you'd be increasing the cost anyway if you're going to try to add it into the Health Act, like on a federal level. So
you mean like let me see if I got what you meant here. So like you incorporate, you look at the kinds of illnesses and the needs for medication within a region of, let's say, Ontario, and then you incorporate these insurance coverages in OHIP or any alternative. I don't know what they're called in the other provinces. They have different names, but kind of like that.
Yeah, so like for Ontario, like into OHIP, and then if you're eligible for this, because if you're going to be taking a prescription medication and you're going to need it, you're probably going to be taking it for a long time. So it'd be like applying for like, I don't know, a loan or something at a bank, right? Like you're applying to get this prescription drug, and then the government covers it for, you know, however long you need it.
I think that'd be a good idea. Like you said, it wouldn't fix everything and it's still a cost, but it's a small step that could probably help a lot of people.
Yeah, and over the long term, you would increase that list to a lot, because, you know, we're constantly developing new medications. Individualized therapy is becoming more and more the standard care in, you know, for many patients. And keeping the healthcare system stagnant like it is now is only making patient outcome worse, right? So we have to like update the regulations in a way like this with the way that medicine is evolving as well.
That's fair.
So any other closing thoughts for this week's podcast, or I think we should wrap it up? Maybe some conclusions on what we talked about?
So I think we can all conclude that this disparity is definitely not ethical, and we should find, or at least search for, both short-term and long-term ways to counter that.
And although we realize that economically it's not feasible to expect short-term changes, but as we kind of compare to the UK, over the longer term, the government should and probably is looking to make pharmaceuticals more available at a lower price to as many people as possible. And so maybe even administering a case-by-case basis for any person who requires a certain alternative treatment. We could maybe have a system in place that, you know, funds individual cases depending on how severe the illness. And yeah, maybe go from there and see what the government is up to. And we can always return to this in the upcoming months and see how things change with the economic climate as well. It's kind of difficult to tell where we're going to go from here. So good to wrap it up here.
Yep. Thanks for listening, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Yep. See you guys.